The things we carry and hold on to often define who we are. Notes and letters, our favorite books, pieces of jewelry. These are just some of the many objects that people accord sentimental value to. They often tell a story about the defining moments of the eras in which we live and how we became who we are. Well, from that basic assessment, Aanchal Malhotra revisits the 1947 partition of British India into the two separate nations of India and Pakistan. In her book, Remnants of a Separation, I have the pleasure of welcoming her on Perspective today. Aanchal, thank you so much for joining us.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me.
So before we get into your book, I have to ask, do you have a personal connection to the partition that made you want to write this book?
I do. All four of my grandparents were impacted by it. They had to cross the border from what became Pakistan into India. So it was very much bolstered by a personal family effort.
And what insight do you think, to move into the kind of the meat of your book, what insight do you think that everyday objects offer that history in the strictly classical sense fails to grasp?
I think for a very long time, the narrative of partition was defined by silence, particularly by those who witnessed them, people like my grandparents. And when I started to speak to them, all I found was reluctance. But when I introduced an object, say an object they carried or an object their parents had given them from wherever they had migrated from, that object started to open stories of a home they had left behind and memories that they could not revisit because the border between India and Pakistan is still quite contentious. And these objects were very mundane. They were books and shawls and things like pens. But I think the moment you hold something from the past in your hand, it makes the past a lot more tangible and graspable. And that's what I was noticing with these objects. And of course, they led to conversations.
And speaking of some of these objects, Aanchal, what are some of the stories or the objects that you came across in your book that struck you most?
They were an array of things, everything as mundane as someone's college notebook they would have taken with them, or things like pens. But there were also really bizarre things like I found this 15.5-foot crocodile carcass that someone had carried from India to Pakistan because they had hunted this crocodile down in the 30s and it was a prized possession. But there were also unusual things like people carried food items, they carried jewelry, they carried weapons, lots of swords. I found guns people had carried for protection because they walked or they took trains, and it took a long time to to get from one part of the border to the other. So there are an array of objects, really.
And to move maybe away from the objects and more to the general context, you've talked about how you hoped that your book would help unmake who we consider to be the other. The way I understand it, deconstruct stereotypes that we have about each other. Can you expand upon that?
For a long time, the perception of Pakistanis in India and Indians in Pakistan has been formed by this border we share. And it always seemed really bizarre to me that people that were once one can actually perceive people now on the other side as someone they don't understand or recognize. And I think this is pretty evident when Indians and Pakistanis meet overseas, say in places far away from this border in America or the UK or any other country in the world, and we find that we are very similar. But when we are in our territories, we are more territorial of them. So the one thing actually the object led to is the democratic nature of belonging, because objects that were being used in Indian households that came from Pakistan were also being used in Pakistani households that had come from India. And I think that's what, when people read this book and they see that an Indian or a Pakistani feels the same way as they do, it starts to deconstruct how we perceive people across the border. And we think twice before saying the things we would have ordinarily said about them.
Certainly lessons that could be applied even outside of India and Pakistan. Earlier this year, Narendra Modi chose the date of August 14th to mark Partition Horror Remembrance Day. I think it really begs the question of how the historical event of partition is remembered and by whom. Do you think that it means something different for all of the different communities that make up India and Pakistan?
Well, I think that it is a good thing to remember what happened because for so long, partition was an event of silence and really locked into the past, and people felt like it couldn't actually impact present day. But I think along with remembering the horrors, you also need to remember that both sides lived through the horrors. And that is my takeaway, that it's great to denote a day to remember what happened, but we also need to denote the day to be kind to our neighbors who also lived through the same thing and maybe carrying similar memories.
Do you think that this holiday is something that risks sowing further division?
It's yet to be seen. There was a big debate that came out as he announced the day, particularly because it was done on the Independence Day of Pakistan, August 14. But I think that it is a good thing to commemorate what happened. We have no memorials to partition in India, despite it being such a formative event in the modern history of the subcontinent. We have no memorials in India or Pakistan. So I think this is the beginning to recognize the catastrophic and colossal nature of what happened in 47.
And similarly, I think also what struck me about Modi's announcement is that it kind of brings to light the dual nature of remembering history. On the one hand, it can bring a lot of trauma back to the surface, but on the other, it can heal wounds and allow for reconciliation. Do you see these two realities kind of reconciled by the people and the objects profiled in your book?
I've wondered this many times. In fact, I've wondered even the days we celebrate independence, August 15 in India and August 14 in Pakistan. I wonder how people who lived through partition feel on these days. Because as a scholar of partition, having studied it for nearly a decade now, I feel empty on these days. I don't feel like celebrating independence because it's a double-edged sword. It comes with the pain of partition. The joy of freedom came with the pain of partition. And so I wonder, it bears to notice next year how it'll be on that day. I don't think I can say right now.
Certainly a difficult topic to expand upon, takes some time. I think for a last question, Aanchal, if you had to summarize, what did you learn about how life was prior to partition and afterwards for the people who lived through it?
I think it was a great moment of upheaval. People lived in, I mean, imagine this. Imagine if I tell you that you have 3 hours to pack your entire house and leave and go to a place you've never seen, speak a language you've never spoken, live in a refugee camp that you could have never imagined. How would you feel? And I always try to put myself in that position. My grandparents lived through it. And I think it disrupted people's lives in a manner that they think of it as before partition and after partition. It's really like a breaking point in their lives. And what was fractured was community and friendship and, people who loved one another despite their different religions. But I mean, of course, this is a very simplistic way to look at it. But when you talk to people who lived through partition, they will remember the nostalgia of the past.
And thanks to your book, it's so much more accessible for people across the world to remember that historical event. We'll have to keep it there for now. Thank you so much, Aanchal Malhotra, for coming on the program today.
Thank you.